Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. So, once again, it is my pleasure to welcome to the program Professor Richard Wolff. He needs no introduction, but I'll give a brief one. Economist, host of Economic Update Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV, as well as a podcast, and someone from whom I always learn a great deal. So, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Before we launch into our main topic, we're always talking about bad economic news here. So I wanted to share with you a good piece of news that I received courtesy of the Wall Street Financial Times, I guess it was, which is as follows. Luxury goods are recovering more quickly, and the corporations that sell luxury goods are doing much better than people expected, 30% ahead of forecasts. A couple of these luxury companies are outdoing their 2019 performances for the first quarter of that year as opposed to the first quarter of this year. So who says things are bad in the economy? Luxury goods are moving just fine. Thank you very much. Any thoughts on that before we go into the larger topic?
No, it's like a textbook. When we teach economics in the university, which is what I've been doing all my life, we teach, for example, the following logical inference. If you increase income and wealth inequality, what that means is the mass of people are pinched and squeezed and cannot buy the way they used to. But the folks at the top are rolling in money and will therefore have what is called a wealth effect. That is, if your wealth goes up, you feel much freer about spending money. And so we can understand that the pinched wealth of the mass makes them spend less, and the inflated wealth of the rich makes them spend more. I got the same kind of good news, in quotation marks, last week when across my computer flashed the results of the Rolls-Royce company in terms of its sales, which are off the chart. They've had the best first quarter of the year, January, February, March of this year, than they've ever had for their two major brands, models, I forget their names, but those go for between $350,000 and $400,000 per automobile. So they are smiling all the way to the bank.
So you can have Rolls-Royce at your city place, Rolls-Royce at your country place, take the helicopter out.
That's right.
Gucci, the brand Gucci apparently has had some rebranding difficulties. It's still up 5% in the first quarter over 2019. So I guess the lesson here is I think the investors in these brands and the people who are profiting from them don't seem to be afraid that any of the recovery plans currently in place or in motion or passed, at least in the United States, are going to impinge on the ability of the well-to-do to buy luxury goods at any time in the foreseeable future. So what are we to conclude from that? I guess the conclusion I would make is that the wealth inequality we've been seeing skyrocket is nobody expects it to reverse anytime soon. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, and I think it shows, and just to extend your point, that whatever the difference is between Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump, each of them in his own way is comforting to the folks at the top. Mr. Trump's form of comforting them was to give them the biggest tax cut in a long, long time in 2017. Coming at the end of a 40-year period when wealth and income were redistributed from the bottom and the middle to those at the top. Never have the wealthy needed a tax cut less than the time they got it from Mr. Trump. And now that we have Mr. Biden, the continuing inflation of the prices of stocks on the stock market and the varying proposals for spending not offset by taxing the rich in any meaningful or significant way, comforts them in yet another way. The government will be spending on all the companies whose welfare is their wealth, and the government will not be taxing them to pay for it. So it is time to buy one or two Rolls Royces, to get dressed up in your Gucci finest. I noticed that one of the selling points of those Rolls Royces is that you can have, while you're sitting in it, a nighttime sky projected on the roof, the interior roof or ceiling of the automobile, so that you can sit back and enjoy an artificial nighttime twinkling stars in the firmament while you're being driven by your chauffeur to get some more Gucci outfits in case the ones you have go out of fashion sometime in the next half hour.
Of course, people could just live in pre-enclosure movement cottages and go look at the sky, and we wouldn't have to be destroying the planet to maintain the illusion of
They don't,
their stars.
right, but Richard, they don't buy those cars in order to travel. They buy those cars precisely to underscore for themselves and everyone else that they are not required to go to the cottage at night to look at the sky. They can do that, but they can also do something that those with cottages looking at the sky cannot do, which is ride downtown, pick up a Gucci outfit while looking at the stars inside your Rolls Royce.
Well, that's a must-have.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can get that installed in my used Subaru.
Yes.
But all of this is by way, I suppose, of introducing the idea that we've now had the second bill introduced from the Biden administration, being touted as the climate plan. Activists have been pushing for $10 trillion. This is considerably less than that. We have, it's of course following upon the recovery plan, the American Recovery Plan. And the last time you and I talked, Richard Wolff, we began to talk about what an actual recovery plan would look like. And I suppose we can add to the conversation now as we continue what an actual climate plan might look at. And obviously I have thoughts about it, but I wanted to hear yours.
Well, for me, I would, as a minimum, take as my model to emulate what was done the last time we had a crisis anything like as severe in both economic and other terms in the Great Depression of the 1930s. We did not at that time have a pandemic. We didn't have a public health crisis on top of the economic crisis, but it was similar in the sense that the economic crisis was even worse than the one we have now. And so here's some of the things we did then, which we should have done all last year and we should be doing now. And I have more than that to offer, but I think it would be modest to begin by doing something again that we have tried and done successfully the last time the United States needed it. So let me begin with the biggest one. We ought to give every adult, able-bodied person in the United States at this time a job, paying them a good, solid income, able to pay for their housing, their medical care, their food, their clothing, and a decent life to educate their children. We should do that, because that's the decent, dare I say, Christian thing to do. We should do it because those at the bottom have suffered. because they haven't had jobs or they haven't had jobs at a decent income. And I don't mean $5 an hour. I don't mean the minimum wage of $7.25, and I don't mean $15 an hour. I mean more than that, since every economist I know understands that a decent minimum costs more than all of that. The government could do that if it spent the money it is now spending on the care bill and on the infrastructure proposals and the climate proposals. The amounts of money there are more than we need to do what I just said. But let me point out that I mean also the immigrants in this country. They too. And the reason you would give them jobs and incomes is not only that they could therefore contribute more to the United States than they are now able to do, but you would take away the single most important tension causer between immigrants and natives. They wouldn't be competing for too few jobs. They wouldn't have the bitterness and the envy when someone in the other group gets a job and they don't have one, and blaming each other. Do away with that. If you really care about not treating immigrants in awful, unchristian ways, then here's a way to do that practically. And we ought to be doing that, and we ought to have done it all along. It's a crucial part of it. Number three, the reason to do it. And the reason to do it, let me stress, is because this is the opposite of trickle-down economics. You could call it trickle-up. It's the way you boost the entire economy, not by giving the money to the richest, hoping it trickles down, but by giving money to the poorest, the ones who need it most, because we know it will trickle up. When you give money to rich people and big corporations, those are the rich people who save, i.e., they don't spend a large part of what they get. Whereas when you give the money to the poor, they have to spend every nickel because that's the condition they're in. So you know that if you give it to the immigrant, if you give it to the unemployed native worker, they will be spending it on food, clothing, shelter, and everything else pretty much as fast as they get it. So it will trickle into the hands of the local stores and the local businesses, etc., and fatten their profits. Let me give you an example to close this point, that there are already parts of the United States that are doing that. A couple of weeks ago, the state of New York passed its annual budget for this year and next. In that budget, if my memory serves, $200 million was put in the budget to give jobs and income supports, get ready, for undocumented immigrants in the state of New York. Republicans joined Democrats in voting for that portion of the budget. And you know why? Because many of the poorest communities in upstate New York, savaged by the exit of businesses from that area, many of those towns have sizable immigrant, undocumented populations, and they began to understand trickle-up economics, that giving money to those undocumented immigrants, either as jobs or as welfare or as family supports or a variety of help, will be trickling up and keep afloat businesses that would otherwise have gone under, communities that would otherwise have disintegrated further. So the whole society benefits from this kind of a mass employment at a decent wage. The private capitalist sector is unable to do that. Private capitalists are not going into many American communities, particularly those with immigrants, but with many poor communities as well. And so I would argue that here is a way to make make amends, if you like. Over the period of 2020, if I could conclude this just point,
Sure.
over that period, over 60 million Americans had to file for unemployment compensation. Some of them only for a few weeks of unemployment. Others were unemployed the entire year. When you're unemployed, you use up any savings you might have had. You become a burden on the savings of others in your family, your friends, your neighbors, your community. Those costs are still there. They haven't been compensated. I'm not even talking about the people who have thousands of dollars in unpaid rent looming over their heads. They need help, and the communities that depend on them need help. A proper recovery program would include, whether its ostensible purpose is climate or COVID or anything else, it ought to be based on helping those who were hurt the most, who are the most needy, knowing of the trickle-up benefits that will flow from them. And as to what they can do, oh my God, it's a laundry list that we could all write down in 10 minutes. We haven't tested Americans anywhere near as much as we could. We should have an army of testers from the unemployed. We should have an army of people trained to help the elderly, sick or not sick, to provide the daycare that working parents desperately need in this society, to do all the work on greening America. Come on, there's no shortage of useful work, and the private capitalist sector either isn't doing it or is doing it very slowly. The government could and should help the people who need it and make this process happen way better and way sooner than private capitalism gives us any hope to see.
Well, Richard Wolff, you know better than I what the standard objections are to such a program. One would be the government can't afford it. Two would be, well, in the private sector would go, a lot of businesses would go broke trying to match or exceed these wages. And as far as immigration, which I'm an enthusiastic supporter of, oh, well, you can't do that because if you guarantee them jobs, then they, remember the other, will all come here and will be in even worse shape than before. So what do you say when people raise those objections to you?
Well, you know, I'm an economist, so let me wear my hat as an economist. If those objections are maintained, then I would summarize them by saying the following. The capitalist system that we have, a system of markets, free enterprise, whatever else you want to call it, is a system that cannot accommodate the basic needs of millions of people. It can't give them a job, or it can't give them a job at a decent income that allows them to live a decent life in our society. Okay, that's how we judge the adequacy of an economic system. Does it do that, or does it not? We are critical of many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America based on nothing much more than a casual observation, accurate, that a mass of people live in a condition we think is unacceptable given the modern world. You know, the UN keeps track. An enormous proportion of the people of the world do not have an operable running water toilet, or they do not have safe drinking water, or they do not have adequate schooling for their children beyond the rudimentary first few grades. And I could go on and on and on. And so we say these countries desperately need help because what? They have failed to provide a basically adequate standard of living for their people. Okay, if that standard applies to them, it applies here too. So for me, let me reverse what you're saying and turn it around. If it's true that we can't provide jobs, that the private capitalist sector cannot provide full employment at a decent wage, so that millions and millions of Americans and the innocent members of their family must suffer, then that's a sign that this system is busted. It's broken. It's not working. And that has to be faced. For me, it's the same thing as saying the United States has 4% of the world's population and 20% of the world's COVID deaths. I don't have to hear anymore. I don't want to hear anymore. That's unacceptable. That 500,000 plus people are dead is a sign that this system, with all of its wealth and with all of its medical apparatus, couldn't protect the American people the way many countries with poorer resources and poorer medical apparatuses proved able to be. That's a systemic failure. So one part of me says, okay, that's your argument? That you can't afford it? Okay, you've just written your own death sentence as a system, because that's the sign that the system is over, especially because we know exactly what can be done. That's why I began with the example of the 1930s and the federal jobs program, which, by the way, in the 1930s, when we were a much smaller country, hired 15 million people who thereby could make their rent payments, who thereby could feel good about themselves, who thereby didn't lose their skills, who thereby didn't lose their connection with their employers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we know it works. We know how to do it. It's just that private capitalism couldn't do it in the 30s, which is why Roosevelt made it a state program. Only the difference now is, again, capitalism fails, but the private politicians at the top, Mr. Biden at the head, aren't FDR, no matter how much he pretends it. So they can't even do what he did, let alone the greater activity, which I could easily prescribe for them.
Let me, Richard Wolff, also add to this discussion of recovering from the pandemic, if I may, with a very brief start, and I'll make it very brief. But I have a couple health conditions that had put me at very high risk for COVID. And I was reading some of the policy debates, and one of them included the proposal that people like me with identified life-threatening conditions should not get put to the head of the list, but rather that Black and other communities of color people, all of them should be put to the head of the list. The logic, and of course, when someone says your potential death is an acceptable policy outcome, it gets your attention. And the reason given was because, and it's quite true, many people in the Black community don't have health coverage. So many will have conditions like mine and not know it. But what was striking to me about that was that it never seemed to occur to the people holding this policy discussion that the right solution is to give everybody, Black and white, rich and poor, better health care than I have, without the copays and deductibles I have to pay, so that they can then go out and find out what's wrong with them too and get the treatment I get. Now, it seems to me there's a kind of blindness here, like a color blindness to the palette of political possibility, if you can't see that the proper response to the COVID pandemic includes health care for everyone. And I'm sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but aren't I right? I mean, doesn't universal health care coverage fit in here somewhere?
Absolutely, but you raised this wonderfully important question that people can't think about it. They're so used to thinking inside narrow boxes that the very idea of being other than that is difficult, is unimaginable, strikes them as crazy or wildly utopian. Let me give you some examples to help people get beyond that by showing them how that was done in the past. For a very long, here's my first, I'm going to give you two examples. First example, for a very long time, and it even exists in some parts of the world today, although not many, but for a very long time, it was thought that when a young man or woman reaches their teen years or puberty or whatever you want to call it, the age when you begin to think about sex and you begin to think about marriage and children, that it's time to think about mating. I'm trying to use as neutral words as I can think of. Okay.
We get it.
And at that point, we know how it was handled for most of the human history. The parents of any particular young man or woman would contact the parents of some other young man or woman, and they would arrange a marriage. They would arrange for the whatever the particular culture was for the mating arrangement to be done. The idea that the young people themselves would initiate, pursue, control all of this was thought unthinkable. The young people don't know what they're doing. The young people are controlled by their hormones or whatever arguments. And so we did. Well, nowadays, if you said to a young person reaching, say, I don't know, 17, 18 years of age, well, it's time for your mother and father to find you a partner, they'd roll over laughing at the very proposition because it would be so ludicrous. They wouldn't permit it. It's a bad joke at best. Let me give you a second example. For an awful long time, in feudalism and until early capitalism, the vast majority of people thought that civilization itself could not possibly survive if there weren't a king or a czar or an emperor, that we, the rest of us, were all subjects of this. This person was understood to be the vicar on earth for God. The Roman Catholic Church has the Pope still occupying something like this in-between, the emissary, the agent of God, et cetera, and that to get rid of that king, to not have a king, was to be a body without a head, a mass without a leader. You couldn't, the society would fall apart. And then a time came when the kings were dispatched, often in a very blunt way, with a guillotine, for example. Now the king was gone. Did civilization stop? No. Did civilization crumble? No. It's sort of like what happened when young people took over their own mating arrangements. The world didn't come to an end. These ways of thinking gave way. And you know what? The notion that a business has to be run by a little dictator at the top, the CEO who's in charge, the little king copy that we have inside our enterprises, we have no more need of them than we did need the head of the community where we are residential members. We don't allow a king, not in the village, not in the state, and not in the federal government. And in the few countries that still have kings, they're overwhelmingly ceremonial adornments because we don't take it seriously. These ideas take a while to undo. Mm-hmm. The most important thing is for those of us who can see that we don't need a king, to say it, to keep it in people's consciousness. That, plus the breakdown of the societies supposedly held together by these ideas and these institutions, those two things, the breakdown and us articulating an alternative, that's the magic formula to get change.
And of course, we've seen in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of investment firms, venture capital firms, talking about how they're going to invest in Black-owned businesses which will enrich them, the venture capitalists, and perhaps one black person who owns the firm, as opposed to saying what I've been trying to get people to say, which is investing in black worker-owned businesses would help everybody involved in that company, the people producing its goods, not just one person at the top. I know
if
you
I,
have.
if you would,
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
if you would allow me, the verbiage of all of these corporate types, these venture capitalists and others, the verbiage is one thing. The reality remains to be seen. The cheapest, easiest way to deal with the horror of how this society has always treated its African American people from the time of slavery to the present has periodically exploded in the face of this society, leading the white leaders of the time to say, oh, we have to attend to this problem. We have to be more sensitive. We have to be more inclusive. We've heard it all before. And every time before, the best you got was tokenism, a few, like you just said. But to attend to, it's a mass problem. The verdict in Minneapolis, that was a verdict of a particular case. But that case, George Floyd, that's part of a social problem. And that's only solved by a social change, by a social movement pushing for a social change. If that's not understood, if that is dealt with as an individual, and you then magically imagine that because of this individual change, the social problem will be solved, then you're going down the same self-deluded ways of thinking that have been the norm in the past.
And there's so much more I want to ask you about, Richard Wolff, but I know you have limited time. So I will conclude for now. First of all, by thanking you. Secondly, by letting our listeners and viewers know that all of our conversations, yours and mine, are now available on YouTube in one playlist to youtube.com/The Zero Hour, and you'll find them there. So if people enjoyed this, and I hope they did, they can go back and hear more. And once again, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, RJ. I look forward to these conversations, and I appreciate very much that you put them together and make them happen.
And that's it for this week's program. We'll be back next week on Free Speech TV, same time, same place. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this has been The Zero Hour.